There's a reason the questions around Eric Carroll have not gone away. Because the story stopped being only about the Whitaker family a long time ago. It became about money, promises, influence, and whether vulnerable people were surrounded by helpers or by opportunists pretending to help. And now one question keeps surfacing again and again. Where did the money actually go? That question is heavier than people realize because it is not simply about receipts or totals. It is about trust. People watched a struggling family living in poverty. They watched viewers donate out of sympathy. They watched creators arrive with cameras, trips, projects, plans, and emotional speeches about helping the Whitakers build a better life. But years later, the house still deteriorated. The family was eventually separated. Investigations began, and the public was left trying to understand how so much attention produced so little stability. That is the space where Eric Carroll now finds himself being questioned. Not because every accusation against him has been legally proven. They have not. That distinction matters. But because the public watched him place himself near the center of the story, and once you stand near the center of a story involving vulnerable people and money, people eventually begin asking where accountability starts and where it ends. Eric's critics point toward contradictions. He described buying things for the family. Then viewers later heard some of those same things were donated. Pizza, outings, supplies, equipment, trips, gifts. The details may sound small individually, but when enough inconsistencies collect around a public fundraising environment, suspicion starts growing. Not necessarily because one single item proves wrongdoing, but because patterns create doubt. And doubt is exactly what now surrounds this entire story. One of the loudest criticisms centers around the famous air conditioner Eric discussed publicly. According to critics, he described spending roughly $149 on an air conditioner unit intended to improve the Whitaker home. But people later examined images of the property and began asking why it appeared installed near the kitchen entrance instead of in the main living space where vulnerable family members actually spent most of their time. Now on its own, that sounds almost absurdly small. An argument about air conditioner placement. But critics argue it represents something larger. They say it symbolizes what they view as performative help. Quick fixes designed to look helpful on camera rather than thoughtful long-term improvements that genuinely stabilize the family's living conditions. Whether that interpretation is fair or not, it has become part of the public perception surrounding Eric. And perception matters once trust begins collapsing. Because people started asking harder questions. If large amounts of public sympathy and donations existed around the Whitaker family for years, why was there never a stable housing solution? Why did conversations about new homes, land, renovations, and rebuilding seem to drift endlessly without producing permanent results? Why did creators repeatedly describe the conditions as emergencies while simultaneously continuing to film inside those same conditions month after month? These are uncomfortable questions because they point toward the possibility that instability itself became part of the content ecosystem. A stable Whitaker family living quietly in a clean mobile home would not generate the same emotional reaction online as a collapsing household filled with chaos, conflict, and visible poverty. That does not automatically mean anyone intentionally wanted the family to suffer. But it does create moral tension around how much incentive existed to keep filming dysfunction instead of quietly solving it. And Eric's critics believe that tension cannot simply be ignored. Another major issue involves the percentage split attached to the family's online content. Critics repeatedly ask why vulnerable adults whose likenesses drove the views allegedly received only a partial share while creators and organizers controlled platforms, editing, monetization, and distribution. Eric has defended the arrangement publicly by describing operational roles and behind-the-scenes responsibilities. But critics argue the larger ethical question remains unresolved. How do you fairly compensate people who may not fully understand internet monetization itself? That question sits underneath almost every controversy connected to the Whitakers, because the family was not navigating this environment as media professionals. They were vulnerable adults living in rural isolation, suddenly surrounded by cameras, contracts, live streams, trips, audiences, donations, and competing personalities claiming to help. And once the public realized that, suspicion deepened, especially after adult protective services entered the picture. Eric has publicly pushed back against claims that he orchestrated removals or secretly manipulated state systems against the family. He argues he responded to concerns already unfolding inside the household. He describes protective orders, safety fears, medical vulnerabilities, and requests for help. He portrays himself as someone reacting to instability rather than creating it. But critics point towards something else. They argue the urgency surrounding the household dramatically escalated once creators entered deeper into the family's daily life. Police visits increased. Protective orders emerged. APS involvement intensified. Public scrutiny exploded. Internal family tensions became public spectacle. And they ask a brutal question. Did intervention happen because the family was suddenly in danger, or because the internet suddenly made the danger impossible to ignore? That distinction matters because it changes how people interpret Eric's role entirely. If he exposed existing problems responsibly, critics may be overstating his influence. But if his presence accelerated instability inside an already fragile family system, then the ethical picture becomes far darker. One of the harshest accusations involves Timmy specifically. Critics repeatedly bring up trips, Airbnb stays, vacations, outings, hotel rooms, and private filming environments involving vulnerable adults who functioned with childlike dependency in many social situations. They ask whether appropriate boundaries truly existed. They question judgment. They question motives. They question why creators seemed increasingly emotionally embedded inside the Whitaker family instead of remaining at safer professional distance. Again, no confirmed criminal findings publicly establish the worst online speculation people spread. That distinction matters enormously. But the criticism persists because audiences watched emotionally intimate access develop extremely quickly between internet creators and highly vulnerable adults. And many people remain deeply uncomfortable with that dynamic, especially because the family itself could not fully control the narrative unfolding around them. Timmy could not explain contracts. Ray could not manage finances. Lorraine could not navigate internet monetization systems. Betty and Larry themselves struggled with poverty, instability, aging, and limited resources. That meant enormous power rested in the hands of the outsiders surrounding them. And whenever vulnerable people depend heavily on outsiders controlling money, transportation, filming, communication, housing discussions, and public storytelling, accountability questions become unavoidable. That is why the money question refuses to dissipate. Not because people are obsessed with drama, but because the final outcome feels emotionally catastrophic compared to the amount of public support surrounding the family over the years. 3 vulnerable adults removed by the state. 2 elderly relatives left behind confused and isolated. Fraud investigations emerging. Creators turning against each other publicly. Donors questioning where funds actually went. Audiences feeling emotionally manipulated. And a family that became globally famous still never receiving the stable, peaceful life people believed donations were helping create. That gap between expectation and outcome is what fuels the outrage now. And Eric Carroll remains one of the names sitting directly inside that gap. Whether future investigations produce formal consequences or not, the public debate itself has already become part of the Whitaker legacy. because this story stopped being only about one family in West Virginia. It became a warning about what happens when poverty, internet fame, vulnerability, money, and public sympathy collide without clear boundaries, professional oversight, or long-term protection structures in place. And the hardest truth may be this. Once vulnerable people become content, every person around them eventually has to answer the same question. Were you helping them live better? Or were you benefiting from watching them struggle? If you have thoughts on the Whitaker family controversy, the ethics of online creators working with vulnerable families, or the ongoing questions surrounding Eric Carroll, leave your perspective in the comments below. The deeper this story goes, the less it starts looking like a simple internet controversy and the more it starts looking like a collision between two completely different worlds. One world moved slowly, privately, and imperfectly inside the hills of West Virginia. The other world moved fast, publicly, and relentlessly online. And somewhere between those two worlds stood Eric Carroll trying to explain why so many people now believe the Whitaker family became something far more valuable to outsiders than they ever were to themselves. Because once the cameras arrived, the Whitakers stopped being just a family. They became a narrative, and narratives generate attention. Attention generates loyalty. Loyalty generates money. Then money changes everything. That is the structure critics believe Eric either failed to recognize or knowingly stepped into. One of the biggest questions surrounding him now is not simply whether money was mishandled. It is whether the very structure built around the Whitakers was ethically broken from the beginning. Because critics argue something important. If vulnerable adults become the emotional centerpiece of monetized online content, then every single person handling that system carries enormous responsibility. Not just legal responsibility, moral responsibility. And that responsibility becomes even greater when the audience donating money believes they are rescuing people from crisis. That is why the details matter so much now. People remember hearing promises about safer housing. People remember hearing about support systems. People remember hearing about long-term plans. People remember emotional speeches about changing the Whitakers' lives forever. But critics now point toward the visible outcome and ask a devastating question. If all this help existed, why did the situation ultimately collapse into state intervention, investigations, and family separation? That question hangs over everyone connected to the story, especially Eric. Because Eric presented himself differently than some of the other personalities surrounding the family. He often and sounded organized, thoughtful, strategic. He talked about systems, channels, operations, structure, future planning. He described wanting to build something sustainable around the family instead of simply filming them for shock value. And for many viewers, that made him appear trustworthy. But trust becomes dangerous once expectations grow larger than visible results. Critics now argue that Eric's explanations often relied on complexity in ways ordinary viewers could not easily verify. Discussions about platform ownership, management responsibilities, revenue structures, operational control, percentages, agreements, and back-end systems created an environment where audiences increasingly depended on trusting explanations rather than independently understanding the situation. That imbalance matters, because when vulnerable families are involved, transparency becomes critical. And many critics believe transparency never truly existed. For example, one recurring criticism involves the idea that creators repeatedly emphasized how much work and sacrifice they personally contributed while simultaneously benefiting from public sympathy surrounding the family. Eric described long drives from Georgia. He described time away from his wife and children. He described handling crises. He described legal paperwork. He described stress, pressure, and emotional exhaustion. Those things may all be true, but critics argue another truth existed alongside them. The Whittaker story itself also generated visibility, audience growth, online influence, donations, attention, and platform engagement for the people surrounding it. That dual reality is what makes this story morally uncomfortable, because helping and benefiting are not always mutually exclusive. Someone can genuinely care while also gaining influence. Someone can genuinely help while also building content. Someone can feel emotionally attached while still operating inside a monetized ecosystem. And once money and emotional attachment combine, motives become difficult even for the people involved to fully understand themselves. That is why this story has become so polarizing online. Some viewers still defend Eric strongly. They point toward the visible improvements Timmy appeared to experience during outings and trips. They point toward cleaner clothes, medical appointments, social interaction, recreation, and moments of happiness that viewers rarely saw before outsiders became involved. To those supporters, Eric helped expose needs the world had ignored for decades. But critics respond with something equally powerful. Temporary moments of joy are not the same as long-term protection. Taking vulnerable adults on trips does not automatically mean the overall system surrounding them was ethical or stable. And if the final outcome was fragmentation, state removal, investigations, and confusion, then critics argue the process itself deserves scrutiny no matter how good some individual moments looked on camera. That debate has now become impossible to separate from the money questions, especially because financial confusion appears repeatedly throughout the Whittaker timeline. Donations, vehicles, supplies, trips, hotel stays, crowdfunding discussions, gifted items, channel revenue, housing conversations, medical claims, legal expenses, people hearing different versions of who paid for what, people later learning some things were donated rather than personally funded, people asking whether the family themselves truly understood the scale of money moving around content built from their daily lives. That confusion created the exact environment where suspicion thrives. And once suspicion grows online, every inconsistency becomes magnified. Every missing detail becomes evidence. Every contradiction becomes part of a larger narrative. That is what Eric now faces. Not a single accusation, but an atmosphere of distrust built slowly over time. One particularly damaging criticism involves the emotional dependency created between the family and outside creators. Critics argue the Whittakers became increasingly dependent on outsiders not just financially, but psychologically and socially. Trips, outings, gifts, transportation, support, legal assistance, advocacy, and emotional reassurance all began flowing through people connected to online content creation. That level of dependency can become extremely risky, because once outsiders become emotionally central inside a vulnerable household, boundaries blur quickly. Who is helping? Who is managing? Who is controlling access? Who decides what gets filmed? Who decides where money goes? Who speaks publicly for the family? Who benefits from continued exposure? Those questions became harder and harder to answer as the situation evolved. And according to critics, Eric sometimes spoke as both participant and interpreter simultaneously. He was not just involved in events. He was also helping narrate events to the public. That creates enormous influence over audience perception, especially when the family themselves could not independently explain everything happening around them. Then came another turning point: the growing perception that the Whittaker story itself had become fragmented into competing camps online. Different creators accusing each other, different audiences choosing sides, different versions of events spreading across live streams, reaction videos, Facebook groups, and commentary channels. Suddenly, the families suffering no longer sat at the center alone. Now there were rival narratives competing for dominance. And critics argue that once that happened, The Whitakers themselves became secondary to the ecosystem surrounding them. An ecosystem built from argument, speculation, loyalty, betrayal, outrage, and endless reaction content. That is where the phrase, "Where did the money go?" transformed from financial question into symbolic question. Because people were not only asking about dollars anymore, they were asking where the goodwill went, where the protection went, where the stability went, where the promises went, where the future everyone described for the family actually disappeared to. And no amount of live stream explanations fully answered that emotional collapse for many viewers. That is why Eric's attempts to defend himself often produce mixed reactions. Supporters hear a man overwhelmed by a chaotic, impossible situation, trying to help vulnerable people while being attacked online afterward. Critics hear someone constantly reframing responsibility without fully confronting how much influence he willingly accepted around a vulnerable family. And between those two interpretations sits the uncomfortable truth. This situation likely contained elements of both. Because human motives are rarely pure. People can care sincerely and still make damaging decisions. People can want to help and still create dependency. People can believe they are rescuing others while slowly becoming trapped inside the attention surrounding the rescue itself. That complexity is what makes the Whitaker story feel unresolved even now. The public still wants one clean answer, one villain, one explanation, one person to blame. But the reality appears far messier than that. A vulnerable, isolated family. Internet fame arriving too fast. Money flowing without clear oversight. Outsiders entering emotionally unstable situations. Creators competing for influence. State systems reacting late. Audiences consuming suffering as entertainment while simultaneously calling it advocacy. And inside all of it, real people trying, and often failing, to understand where help ended and exploitation began. That is why Eric Carroll continues facing explosive questions. Not because every accusation against him has been conclusively proven, but because he became deeply connected to one of the internet's most ethically uncomfortable stories. And once someone steps that deeply into a story like this, the questions rarely stop, especially when the people at the center of the story were never truly capable of controlling it themselves. If you follow the Whitaker family story from the beginning, do you believe the people around them genuinely helped more than they harmed? Or do you think the internet created a situation that spiraled beyond anyone's control? Share your thoughts below. What makes the Whitaker story so difficult to untangle is that almost every person involved can point to something real. Eric can point to medical visits, outings, supplies, transportation, and visible moments where the family appeared happier and more socially engaged than before. Critics can point to confusion around money, inconsistent explanations, emotional dependency, blurred boundaries, and a final outcome that ended with state intervention and investigations. Supporters can point toward years of neglect before internet attention arrived. Skeptics can point toward how quickly vulnerable people became monetized content once that attention exploded. And somewhere inside all of that are the Whitakers themselves, people who often could not fully explain what they wanted, what they understood, or what they believed was happening around them. That is why this story refuses to settle into a clean conclusion. Because the central question is no longer simply, did someone help them? The harder question is this: what happens when helping vulnerable people becomes inseparable from filming them? That is the moral pressure point at the center of the Eric Carroll controversy. Critics believe the cameras changed everything, not just because the family became famous, but because fame itself altered the power structure around them. Once millions of people recognized the Whitakers online, the household stopped functioning like an isolated rural family and started functioning like a public emotional spectacle. Every visitor mattered. Every disagreement mattered. Every live stream mattered. Every dollar mattered. And once audiences became emotionally invested, creators surrounding the family gained influence far beyond ordinary friendship. That influence is what many people now believe was dangerously underestimated, especially because the Whitakers were not internet-savvy adults entering media deals knowingly. They were vulnerable people living inside poverty, dependency, disability, and isolation. That meant the outsiders effectively controlled the bridge between the family and the public. and whoever controls the bridge controls the story. That is where critics argue Eric's role became ethically complicated. Because even if he genuinely believed he was helping, he still occupied a position of enormous influence over how millions of viewers interpreted the Whitakers' reality. He helped shape the narrative. He helped explain events. He helped contextualize conflicts. He helped define who appeared trustworthy and who appeared dangerous. That level of narrative control creates responsibility, whether someone intended harm or not. One recurring criticism focuses on how often emergency language appeared around the family. Urgency, danger, protection, crisis, fear, chaos. Viewers constantly heard that serious intervention was needed immediately. Protective orders, instability, threats, unsafe conditions, manipulation, addiction, pressure inside the home. The story increasingly sounded less like a documentary about poverty and more like an unfolding crisis requiring outside management. Critics now ask whether that escalating atmosphere itself intensified the collapse. Because once vulnerable families become framed as emergencies publicly, state systems eventually begin paying attention. And once state systems enter unstable situations involving vulnerable adults, outcomes can become irreversible. That is exactly what happened. Timmy, Lorraine, and Ray were eventually removed from the home. The family fractured. Betty and Larry were left behind. Investigations emerged. Public arguments exploded online. And audiences who originally believed they were watching a rescue story suddenly found themselves watching a family disintegrate. That emotional whiplash is part of why anger toward Eric remains so intense in some corners of the internet. People feel like they emotionally invested in a promise that never materialized. Not necessarily a spoken promise, but an implied one. The implied promise that exposure would save the Whitakers. Instead, many viewers now feel exposure destroyed what little fragile stability the family still had. That perception may or may not be fully fair to Eric individually, but it exists powerfully online, especially because critics argue something important. Before internet fame, the Whitakers were poor, isolated, and vulnerable. After internet fame, they were still poor, isolated, and vulnerable, except now millions of strangers knew who they were. That contrast deeply unsettles people, because they expected transformation. Instead, they witnessed escalation. And once people begin believing vulnerable individuals were used emotionally for content while meaningful structural change never arrived, every creator involved comes under scrutiny. That scrutiny intensified even further once financial investigations entered public conversation. Because financial investigations changed the tone of everything. Once law enforcement examines fundraising activity, audiences stop interpreting inconsistencies as harmless confusion and begin viewing them through a far more suspicious lens. Suddenly, every claim matters. Who bought what? Who donated what? Who controlled what? Who profited from what? Who knew what? Those questions become unavoidable. And Eric's critics argue he often answered those questions emotionally instead of concretely. They believe explanations frequently focused on intentions rather than transparent accounting. Helping, stress, sacrifice, caring, driving long distances, being misunderstood. Those themes appeared repeatedly in Eric's public defenses. But critics insist emotional sincerity is not the same thing as financial clarity. That distinction matters enormously, because people may sympathize with emotional exhaustion while still demanding accountability, especially when vulnerable adults are involved. One of the darkest aspects of this controversy is how quickly trust deteriorated between nearly everyone connected to the Whitaker ecosystem. Creators accused each other. Supporters split into camps. Former allies turned hostile publicly. Live streams became battlegrounds. Private conflict spilled into public spaces. Receipts, screenshots, recordings, accusations, and counter-accusations flooded social media. The environment became chaotic, and chaos always damages vulnerable people first. That is something many audiences slowly realized too late. While creators fought publicly, the actual Whitaker family continued living inside instability. Medical issues still existed. Dependencies still existed. Poverty still existed. Confusion still existed. Only now those struggles were attached to global public attention. That attention created pressure the family likely never fully understood. Timmy did not understand internet ecosystems. Ray did not understand public controversy. Lorraine did not understand monetized online conflict. Even Betty and Larry themselves appeared overwhelmed by the scale of attention surrounding them. And that reality creates one final uncomfortable question critics continue asking Eric. At what point should outsiders have stepped back? Because helping vulnerable people does not always mean becoming central inside their lives. Sometimes ethical help requires distance, professional systems, boundaries, limited involvement, quiet support rather than public immersion. Critics argue the Whittaker situation moved in the opposite direction. Outsiders became increasingly emotionally embedded inside the family structure itself. Trips, transportation, housing discussions, court appearances, medical coordination, public advocacy, financial management conversations, protective order involvement, APS contact. At some point, the line between helper and participant became difficult to separate. And once that line disappeared, accountability became unavoidable. That does not automatically make Eric malicious. In fact, one of the hardest truths in this story may be that many people involved genuinely believe they were helping while simultaneously participating in systems that harmed the family long-term. Those two things can exist together. Good intentions do not automatically produce good outcomes. And the final outcome here remains devastating regardless of motive. A family broken apart, a home emptied, an ongoing investigation, public distrust everywhere, and vulnerable adults whose lives became internet mythology before anyone built structures strong enough to protect them from what that mythology would eventually attract. That is why the money question still matters so much. Because money symbolizes accountability. Audiences donated emotionally because they believed resources would stabilize the Whittakers' lives permanently. When permanent stability never arrived, people naturally started tracing where resources went instead. And once enough inconsistencies appeared, trust collapsed. That collapse may never fully recover. Not for Eric, not for the creators involved, not even for audiences themselves. Because many viewers now feel complicit too. They watched, shared clips, commented, subscribed, argued, reacted, consumed the story daily, and only later realized they may have been participating in the same system they now criticize. That realization makes people angry. Angry at creators, angry at the internet, angry at themselves. And that anger keeps this story alive long after the original videos stopped feeling new. Because beneath all the controversy sits one haunting truth. The Whittakers were real people, not characters. But the internet often struggles to remember that once a story becomes emotionally addictive. And maybe that is the real tragedy here. Not simply whether money disappeared. Not simply whether creators crossed ethical lines. Not simply whether investigations produce charges someday. But that a vulnerable family became trapped inside a machine far larger than themselves. A machine built from attention, sympathy, outrage, money, entertainment, and endless public fascination. And once that machine started moving, almost nobody involved seemed fully capable of stopping it. If you followed the Whittaker family story over the years, what do you think was the moment everything truly changed? Was it the first viral videos, the money, the creators entering deeper into the family's life, or the involvement of state authorities? Share your perspective below.